Okay, so modifiers in XGen. I've prepared a few cheat sheets for you just to make your life easier, because I know how difficult it is to find a specific part in a video if it lasts for 30 minutes. So for your convenience, I have created these super small slides where you can look up for different settings. For example, this slide is about everything you should do before creating any description, before going to XGen. When you have only like bases for your future descriptions and for your future grooming, it's very important to clear all history. Here are some paths where you can find all the things you need to do. You should freeze all the transformations of these bases, and you shall assign Lambert material. Remember, it's a very important part of this step. And also make sure to get rid of any polygroups in your outliner, because it may ruin your future grooming, believe me. Your outliner should look as clear as possible. So no polygroups, no transforms here, no history, and just very pure list of bases for your future grooming. Let's go to the next step. When you're ready with all this stuff, you can create XGen description. So you just go to XGen shelf and then you click on this icon. It creates this window, it opens it up, and then you click on create new description. Here is the list of everything you shall do. So I really hope it's useful. And the second step, oh no, not the second, but like the fourth step. The fourth step is to choose names for your collection. So for collection, you shall type like the name of the whole project. For example, like loose hair, or like man hairstyle, or woman hairstyle, or dreadlocks. And in this is description, a description for each base. I really recommend you to start your descriptions in alphabetical order, because it will make your life easier. It will automatically sort it by alphabet. So yes. And for each description, really make sure to tick this setting, placing and shaping guides, because by default it's using attributes controlled by expressions. It's not what we really need. The one is here, and really make sure and pay special attention to this tick, and then you shall just click create. Okay, and very important tips for the time you're actually grooming. Please do not rename any geo, any planes, any bases for your hair strands in your descriptions. These are your bases. These are your bases in outliner, and make sure not to rename them by any chance. Please don't do this. And please also do not clear the history, because it can ruin your life. It can ruin your grooming. And just while grooming, while switching all the modifiers and placing guides, don't clear history for any of the geo or for any object in the scene. And do not change the material of the geo. Do not please switch it to any other materials than it was. It should be Lambert. And if something went wrong, please reassign Lambert, because sometimes XGen has different bugs, and it can have some problems with painting maps on these planes. And usually it happens because you have different material, and you should reassign your Lambert, and usually everything fixes. Okay? You can actually explore all the settings in XGen by yourself, because they are very, because you know, like, it's very interesting, and be curious and play with different settings. But here I will be talking about only stuff which I'm using, and here we will go with the first one. It's a preview the description, or you can also click on this little arrow, and you can tick the preview all descriptions. It shows you your hair strands, like your actual hair, or your primitives, because it's called primitives in XGen, or like your hair. And sometimes, for example, if you're adding some modifiers or you're changing the settings and you can't see the difference, make sure to click this little eye several times, so this will refresh the preview. This does the opposite. It can hide all your descriptions or hide the specific descriptions which you have selected. For example, this one is selected now. It's a big strand like this one. We just click it and it will hide it, or we can click and then we can click this eye and it will reveal it. This one helps you to place the guides. These are the guides, and these are actually very important things which tell your hair how to behave. Hair follows the guides, so make sure to adjust the length and to adjust their forms. This little brush will help you to sculpt the guide. Just click on it and you can do whatever you want with the guide. But then you can click on this little icon and it will hide your guides, because usually when you have sculpted them, when you have created them, you don't really need them anymore. You just need to preview your hair, your primitives. These two settings, I rarely use them, but they are extremely helpful in some situations. For example, if you're super satisfied with the hair strand itself, but there are a few hairs which are going too far from the hair strand and they're intersecting the other one, then you can select these primitives by clicking this icon. You are selecting the primitives and then you clicking this icon. It's cull or delete them. So mainly with all this stuff, I use only these like 6 icons. There is also very handy like create description, but I usually go to descriptions and create new descriptions. It's just a habit. If you find it more convenient, also use this one for creating the description. Like main settings which I'm using, which I'm adjusting, are usually density, modifier CV count. I always go for 50 because I usually have like a bit noisy here, but you can set 10 or 20. It doesn't really matter. Then these 3 settings, like width and this graphic and the taper, I usually use to adjust the width, and you want to have this smooth form for your primitives. And also in this section, preview and output, for each description, I untick this setting, only primitives in the view. It helps a lot, so make sure to untick it, because sometimes your hair will be disappearing suddenly, and this helps them to render if their base is not in the view. Okay, as I've said before, name your descriptions alphabetically, because when you're opening up the description list, it is sorted very nice by alphabet. And I only use like four modifiers: clumping, cut, coil, and noise. Usually the first one is clumping, then I go for cut, coil, and noise. And it looks like this. Sometimes I have several modifiers for each type, like 3 clumps or 2 noises, or sometimes there are 3 coils. And yeah, just make sure to experiment with it. Yes, and here is also a cheat sheet for clumping, because usually you have this annoying error saying that you don't have maps for clumping. That's why you need to generate them. So you're selecting the clumping modifier, you go to setup maps, and then you are filling the density. The lower the clamp, the less density it has, and then you click generate, and then you click save. Also, for the first clump, I really love going for guides, because it creates clumps only where guides are generated. So for your first clump, you can also go for just click guide and then click save, and that's all. Okay, we start by creating plane with shift and right click. We'll also scale it up a bit, and we need a clear plane, so we should delete extra edges. That's why we're selecting the edges, and then with Shift we invert the selection and delete all the inner edges. Then we're going to object mode and assigning the texture. As you might remember, the texture that we created during our blockout section. We will be making long hair strands for long and straight hairstyle, like loose hairstyle or ponytail. They would be perfect for any long hair. Always try to keep your outliner as clear as possible. Watch your naming, watch your groups, your history, your transformations. And the same applies to layers. You're using layers to make your workflow as convenient as possible and to keep it simple. I place my blockout texture in the blockout section in layers, and then I duplicate it and rename it as XGen base. This would be the base for our XGen generation. And I also lift it up just a little bit, so this would be more convenient to work with it. I assign new material, Lambert, just because we don't want to mess up with different materials. And I make it a bit transparent so that we could see the blockout layer. With multicut, I divide our base into sections for our future hair strands. With our blockout base, it's super simple. Make sure not to forget about the bottom strands. On the root of each hair strand, I'm extruding the edges. These are the planes that we're going to grow our hairs from. Don't forget to bend them a bit. You should have this very nice angle. Then I'm deleting some faces that we don't really need. Now you want to extract each plane and to separate them. Don't forget to get rid of any groups in your outliner, just because they can cause huge problems while grooming. So also make sure to clear all your history and to freeze transformations. Okay, now we want to scale them down a bit. So we select them all. We should reset our pivot, and that's why we're going to tool settings. While clicking on W, we click on edit pivot and reset it. And then we can scale our planes separately from each other. Okay, you do want to set your project in file and to keep all your files in one place, just because with grooming it's super important. As long as you have different maps for grooming for each hair strand, you want to make sure that they are stored in one place. So click Set Project, then Project Workspace, click OK. And now you have this super nice place for every single texture, scene, autosave, or asset which you're going to produce during your work. To create the description, go to the XGen shelf, click on the first green icon with X sign, the XGen window will appear. Then selecting the geo base for the strand, click Create New Description, and we're going to set our very new collection. The collection usually contains all your descriptions. For example, if you need to grow like 10 hair strands, you should have one collection for all of them. But each description can have each settings and modifiers switched on, so they are kind of independent from each other. Also, don't forget to click on placing and shaping guides. It's extremely important for each of your description. Tick this option on every time you're creating each description. After that, we click on this little icon, add or move guides, and then we can place guides on our plane. I usually place 5 or 6 guides on each plane, but the most important thing is that your guides are like skeleton or like the base for your future hair strand, and every single hair in your future hair strand would follow these guides. So you really need to pay attention to the length of your guides and to the main forms. I scale the guides and rotate them accordingly to my blockout. And then I usually start sculpting them with this very handy tool. It's Sculpt Guys. You can select them all and sculpt the whole form, or you can select them one by one. I usually make the main form like a big clump in the end, and then I select each guide and sculpt it from different angles. Make sure to use soft selection and set the radius with B and middle mouse. But as I mentioned before, don't spend too much time on it, because you just need to set your length and your main forms, which you would try to replicate from your blockout texture. And main features of your hair strand you would add later in modifiers section. Okay, once you're satisfied with the guides, you're spending your time mainly in your XGen menu. We will be tweaking on some specific features and specific settings, but please, in your free time, make sure to play with them all and to kind of investigate and discover the result you're going to have, because it's one of the most interesting parts of every studying. Make sure to increase the modifier sui count. It stands for sections in each hair. I usually just set 50. I would say it's an overkill, but if you have a very intense noise, for example, you want to make sure that your hair represents the result, right? I also increased density, and for these hair strands, they should be quite high. I tweak width. I usually set something to 0.03 or 0.04, something in between. But you can play with it and see which result satisfies you. With taper, we also make our hair thinner towards tips, and we usually want to make tips and roots thinner, which is not quite realistic, but it looks better on texture and it looks better on our future hair strands. So sometimes your hair would disappear from preview, and to prevent it, you want to go to preview output section and to untick this only primitives in the view, and the problem is solved actually. So make it for each description. Pretty much it's all settings that I'm using in this section, but sometimes I also create masks for hair strands because I want to create this very nice density gradient. And to create such map, you should click here, create map, and then you want to name it appropriately. If something goes wrong, you want to know that this stands for like the first hair strand, which is a hair strand, and it's the density map. So make your naming very clear and clean, okay? You also might have some problems when XGen doesn't want to paint on the planes. In this case, make sure you assign Lambert, or you can double check it and reassign the same material like Lambert, and after that this should work, because it's one of the most common problems and usually it solves like this. As you see, I paint very nice gradient like this, and this should create the density which would be sticking on sides, and the most dense part would be in the center. Once you're satisfied with it, Don't forget to click save, otherwise it won't save the map. And now you're good, you're done. In this section, we're gonna add modifiers, and there are only 4 of them which I'm using. It's clumping, cut, coil, and noise. The first one is always clumping, and also the first clumping is also like the most important one, and you can't place anything under it, or you can't replace it with another clumping. It should have the smallest density, or you can also generate it by guides. This means this will generate clumps where your guides are. It works pretty well with the first clump, so I usually click on guide and then save. And as you see, clumps are only on each guide. Each modifier has its own settings, and usually there is a graph or several graphs where you can tweak the strengths of each modifier, so make sure to play with it. And also, as we're talking about clumping, there are lots of effects, and you can also tweak them. I mainly use curl effect and noise effect. You usually want to add just a bit of the effects which you're using, because we would have some specific modifiers after clumping, which would be very handy in this. By the way, in viewport render settings, you can switch on anti-aliasing, like multi-sampling, and you can also increase the sample count. This would make the preview a bit nicer. Adding the next clumping modifier and generating the maps for it, just like we did before, everything is the same, but the density on the higher clumps should always be higher, so it would create subclumps. All modifiers are quite self-explanatory, and the next one will be cut, and actually it cuts the length with this specific modifier like rand. It randomly cuts each hair, and the second number means the highest amount of this cut length. We shall increase it because we have quite a long hair strand, so we won't see if it would be too low. The next one would be coil, just to show you what it does, because we actually don't need it in this sample, in this hair strand, because we have like very straight hairs, and I usually use coil for curly hairs, but yeah, it makes the hair strand curly. And here are 2 different settings, 2 different graphs of count and radius scale. The count scale defines how many curls you have per each strand, and radius stands for like radius or distance which these curls can go from the center of each strand. I hope this makes sense. But if it doesn't, you can always play with it, and it's better when you actually tweak it yourself, because it explains a lot when you're just experimenting with it. In description and that stray percentage, you can define the number, the percentage of hair you want to be affected by this very nice function stray. The first number after the question mark in this expression relates to our selected percentage of hair, like relates to 20% of hair. If I set this expression in the mask, for example, and I set it's 1 to 0, it means that this mask wholly applies to these selected hairs, but it doesn't apply to any hairs which are not in this percentage. This stray expression is extremely handy if we are talking about noise and coil modifiers, because usually I have like one noise modifier which applies to all hair and it has like some low definition. And the other one, the other noise modifier, I can set to stray, and I can go higher with noise, and it will apply only to 15% of my hair strand. So mainly I use only these two expressions. It's rand and stray, and I experiment with it a lot. And I also experiment a lot with graphs, because usually you want to make roots very calm and you don't want any noise there or any curls. And then going to tips, you want to increase the noise and the amount of and the magnitude and the frequency of it. As I've said, the amount of details depend on the length of the hair and how much you will be scaling the strand, but you do want to avoid some details that are eye-catching and that one can spot in the future hairstyle on the repetitive hair strands. Of course, you will reuse each hair strand many, many times. That's why they should be very generic. So the noise and the clumps you're using, they should kind of be generic and not to have some distinctive details. Sometimes I also switch on the screen space ambient occlusion, which helps me to see the volume of each hair strand, and it can be quite handy if you're tweaking some dense and kind of very opaque hair strands. Okay, here I notice that something is wrong with my roots, and they're a bit damaged by modifiers, and I have to fix it because they need to be straight. Is a very It's a kind of very important, because you will see some bugs on your hair strands while placing them on scalp. It's very important to keep clean the area of roots. Sometimes it also might help to make the hair texture a bit darker, because you may see it's more comfortable for eyes to look at it. It's more natural, I would say. Then I compare it with my blockout texture, and it doesn't need to 100% replicate the same hair strand, but it have to be similar in terms of opacity, in terms of noise. So you need to have the similar feeling out of it. That's why we were creating the uh, texture block out the first place. Also, if you see some hairs which are flying away out of the main hair strand too far, you need to fix it because you don't want you don't want different hair strands to intersect each other. As you see, it's all about tweaking, it's all about back and forth, making the same and switching off, switching on, and just lots of experimenting. So take your time and don't hurry. By the way, it's super important to make saves and autosaves because XGen it's not very reliable and it loves to crash, really. So make sure to make autosaves every 30 minutes or less. That's how I save modifiers. You need to click on it and then save modifier, and then you should have the naming, which you would understand later. So I also save all the modifiers that I've been using in this description. When you are ready to create the second hair strand, you click on descriptions, create new description, and you repeat all the same stuff. You don't change the collection and you give the specific naming. So I usually name each hair strand in alphabetical order because because it's easier to find them this way. And then everything repeats. I also place guides, I sculpt them, I make the main forms, and usually it's all about the same stuff. Once you've saved your modifiers, you now can load them, and you click on load user, and then you make them in the right order, like clump 1, 2, 3, then cut, then coil, then noises. And always make these in right order and don't kind of confuse them with each other because order is super important. And also make sure to generate maps for clumping because you need to make it every time you use these modifiers. To make modifiers which are using stray expression work, you also need to set stray percentage to each hair strand. And if you would forget to do this, your modifiers won't work as you want them to. If you see that hair strands intersecting each other, you can select primitives and then call selected primitives. This is how you usually delete separated hairs or primitives. If you see that your hair strand is too long or too short, you can unlock the preview of the guides and then select the sculpt tool and unlock the length, so untick it. You can sculpt it with changing the length. Another way to create guides is to create them with curves using CV Curve tool. The thing that you need to remember is that you always need to start with roots. This is very important to keep in mind because when converting the curves into guides, your start of the curve will be the root of the guide. If you made a mistake with it, you can always reverse the direction in curve menu. It's the last option. This method has some advantages because curves are very easy to manipulate with the soft selection and it's easier to tweak them, while guides usually have some problems. Sometimes you even can't use Control Z with guides because it's blocked, and usually you have only option to delete the guide which has been broken. Make sure to distribute curves evenly from different angles because it's important. You can align the roots closer to the base, but it's not so important because as soon as you convert them to guides, they will automatically stick to description base. So firstly, I will create the new description for the third hair strand. I select the base, then I create description out of it. I name it properly, select placing and shaping guides, click create. And then I'm going to utilities, selecting the curves, selecting curves to guides and add guide. Here you are. You have pretty new guides in your new description. And the rest of the process you already know. Sometimes when you want to modify the guide without sculpt brush, you want to go to guide control points, but you should be extremely careful with it because usually there are many bugs if you are rotating it, and you shall try not to use soft selection too much because it also can have some problems, and the only thing you can do with it is to delete it. For example, in this case, we just wanted to rotate it, and sometimes your Ctrl-Z function doesn't work, so be careful, create autosaves, and don't use soft selection with guides. Okay, sometimes you can open your scene and there is no hair, no descriptions, and it shows you some errors. Don't panic, please. Usually it means that your scene just looped the path to your project, and that's why you need to set project and show it the path, and it will automatically reload every single map and every single description. Okay, for the rest of the process, I usually create different descriptions. I have already mentioned that I create them with the alphabetical naming to switch between them easily. And sometimes I switch off some of the modifiers, sometimes I tweak some modifiers, but usually it's just all about making all the same monotonous work. The last part is always about different intersections. You usually want to check all your descriptions and to prevent different hair strands intersecting each other, because this will make your life extremely difficult while placing the hair strands. And you can always select primitives and call it. We're going to the next part with baking very soon. So see you there.